Hi, I'm Andrea Thompson, Editor-in-Chief at Marie Claire, and I'm delighted to be hosting this panel today to tie in with COP26, arguably the most important global summit ever to tackle the subject of climate change. And it's a subject that needs urgent attention. This summer, we saw wildfires, floods, droughts, and storms ravaging parts of the globe. As we reach the end of 2021, it's no longer a question of preventing climate change, but mitigating its worst effects. This month, COP26 brings together more than 120 world leaders plus 25,000 delegates from 197 countries. It's the biggest diplomatic event on British soil since the Second World War, and a crucial indicator of where we go from here when it comes to tackling the climate crisis on a global scale. As editor of Marie Claire, I feel honoured to be part of the conversation and attending the conference myself. Sustainability is in our DNA here at Marie Claire. When we launched in 1988, we became the first women's magazine to talk about the threat of climate change and the link between global warming and wider human rights issues such as child marriage and girls' education. Despite the fact that in many countries women are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, they are consistently overlooked in policy making. This is incredible when you consider just how crucial women like Greta Thunberg and the UK's own Maya Rose Craig have been in driving change at a grassroots level. Anyway, I'm really excited about unpicking some of these issues today with my brilliant panel of female game changers. We'll be discussing how we make things more inclusive, what we stand to gain from COP26, and where we go from here when it comes to tackling the crisis. So let's meet the panel who are going to introduce themselves.
Thanks very much, Andrea. So my name is Nicole Malilo. I'm Consumer Director at Volvo here in the UK. My role really is all about making sure that everything we do at Volvo is against our strategic objectives, one of which is around sustainability. And I have a team that look after all of our communications, also how we measure data to check that we're on the right path, and ultimately making sure that our consumers have a fantastic experience with our brand. So I've been here about 20 months, ironically started a week before lockdown. I'm not from the automotive industry, so what I hope to bring is really quite a lot of outside thinking in terms of new approaches and really putting the consumer at the heart of everything we do.
We have Erin Baker. She's an award-winning motors journalist and also a Marie Claire contributor. Erin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Yes, I'm editorial director of Auto Trader, and I do the car reviews for Marie Claire, as well as some other women's magazines. And really my expertise lies in more and more in the female consumer, for female drivers, female owners of cars, and trying to bridge the gap between the retail experience, the car owner and media and content, and make sure that the automotive industry speaks to female consumers. And sustainability, electric cars is an increasingly important part of that.
Hello, my name is Poppy Okocha. I am an ecological grower, an activist, and I am Volvo's advocate as well. So I started my studies in 2016 and basically do work to try and encourage connection to nature, because to me that is a really key part of addressing the climate emergency, for people to have a tangible connection to where all things in our life, mainly including food, come from.
And we finally have Marissa. She's co-founder and UK Executive Director of the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy. Over to you, Marissa.
Hi, my name is Marissa. I'm, as you said, the co-founder, UK Executive Director of the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy. I'm a feminist activist and researcher and writer. And what we are really driven by at CFFP is putting a feminist lens on all sorts of different foreign policy issues and helping governments understand what it means to enact feminist values into their work, into these historically very patriarchal spaces. That's me.
Volvo was actually one of the most high-profile firms urging the G20 to end fossil fuels, weren't they? Can you talk us through some of the big goals that you guys have as we approach 2030 and beyond?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is a massive ambition that we all need to get behind. And certainly there have been car manufacturers doing this for a long time, but I think it's over and above the kind of brand-led approach, and it's much more purpose-led, which is why we're now talking about it from a wider lens, partnering with opportunities like Eden Project to make sure that it's really enabling that educational piece as well as the product itself, because that on its own is not enough. And I think in answer to your question, for us, it's really about becoming that blueprint for the industry, just like we did with the seatbelts. I think, ultimately, Volvo obviously patented to design the seatbelt, but we didn't patent it because we wanted to make sure that safety was available to everybody. And we've taken that to another level, and we've made sure that not everything is designed just for the sort of standard male typical frame, and that actually we've adapted it to make sure that everybody has accessibility to that safety message and that safety feeling as they're in our cars. But in answer to the question, we now want to make sustainability as important as safety. And in fact, it's something we've been doing for quite some time. It's not a new thing. We've just got more noise now about it, which is fantastic. I think we've got some wonderful ambitions that we're absolutely behind, only launching new cars that are fully electric, and also launching a fully electric car every year. And I think all of that is really important to us. But I think it's important that our employees and everyone who works on the brand feels that they can contribute in some way, because otherwise the ambitions can feel quite far away. So one of the things that we're doing here is making sure that our internal branding and our internal communications are as important to us as our external comms as well. So yeah, there's so much going on from both an internal and a product-based comms that we're doing across the board.
A recent study by Volvo and the Future Lab actually found that 2/3 of consumers consider a brand's environmental policies as a critical factor when purchasing luxury products. I mean, that's quite incredible, isn't it? Can you talk us through Volvo's conscious design report and collaboration with Philip Lim?
Yeah, and I think this links into the point as well around that's already been mentioned about the pandemic. So there's nothing bigger in people's minds than this. Lots of things coming together now for this to be at the forefront of everyone's mind, particularly as we look at the new consumer coming through. They're entirely different to the consumers of today in their mindset. They're really, really vocal, particularly about sustainability. They want to know exactly what corporations are doing against the climate change. It's not good enough just to talk about products anymore. As I said, it needs to be purpose-led. So we're making sure that we are really being quite open and honest with what we're doing there, because they want to choose employers based on that commitment to that. So this report that we saw really shows that premium, which is obviously what Volvo is all about, has changed really in terms of the lens on that. So it's not linked to new anymore. Actually, these consumers are telling us that the premium really now is about recycled, repaired and considered materials, and they want to know exactly how brands are responding to this. So we have taken the opportunity to partner with Philip Lim, a really interesting collaboration to use some of those materials to create a leather-free unisex bag, using materials that we'll then go on to use in our cars that are much more climate conscious and much more sustainability led.
Thank you. Erin, I'd like to invite you in here because I want to talk a bit more specifically about the role that the motors industry has, which is a huge one, to play in terms of tackling carbon emissions and the climate crisis. You've been a motoring journalist for 13, 14 years. What key changes have you witnessed in the industry during that time in terms of sustainability? And do you think that there are really genuine shifts going on towards doing things differently?
Yes, to slightly flip those questions on their head, I suppose. Do I think there are genuine moves going on? Yes. How genuinely they might be felt is up for debate. Most OEMs, most car brands have been mandated by the government to reach certain emissions targets by whether it's 2025, 2030, 2035, depending on the country. So whether consumers like it, whether car brands like it or not, we are all headed towards an emissions-free tailpipe scenario, the question then becomes, well, what is the carbon footprint of the manufacturing process and so on, which I guess we'll come on to. But to take it back to your first question, actually, it's probably coming up for 20 years nearly that I've been a motoring journalist. And you know, back then, manufacturers were already looking at smaller engines, you know, big V10s and V8s, where people were starting to think, well, hang on, we can take much smaller engines and turbocharge them and supercharge them, and they'll use less fuel and produce fewer emissions, but we can maybe get the power another way. And that was the beginnings of the movement towards lowering emissions from cars. Then, of course, people started going into electric. Tesla, I mean, you can't underestimate the part that Tesla has played in this. We started looking at plug-in and pure electric. Brands like Volvo also started looking at sustainable interiors, because it's not just about tailpipe emissions, it's all about recycled materials, substitutes for leather and wood and chrome and all these things that have dreadful energy usage and carbon footprints in the manufacturing process. And now here we are today, where I think rapidly consumers are getting on board with this now. Everyone has woken up to the fact that we do all have individual parts to play in this, and we want to. Car brands want to. Who doesn't want to now play their part in reducing their carbon footprint? But there's a lot to do in lowering costs to make that achievable for consumers. There's a lot to do to a bit to the point that we were making before, actually, how do you get the sustainability conversation out of the arena of affluent consumers who can afford a second car, a third car, and start doing stuff with their emissions there, and actually make it a wholesale choice for everyone and easily accessible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and almost it sort of reflects on Poppy's point about sustainability. Sometimes it can be quite a privileged, you know, it's quite privileged to be able to be sustainable and choose electric cars and live these lifestyles. But until we kind of make it a fully mainstream thing for everybody and cheap enough for people to buy into that sort of lifestyle, you know, nothing will really change. What do you think has taken electric vehicles out of that sort of niche space and into the mainstream over the last couple of years, though? Do you think that it's possibly like lockdown and people reevaluating their choices, or, you know, do you think it's the pressure, you know, larger market forces at work?
I think that a whole host of things happily have happened. One is that on the industry side of things, the rate of battery development has meant that batteries now have a longer range and they're cheaper. So electric cars are getting more usable for a larger percentage of the population, which is really great and has been a game changer for that. We have to remember that, you know, the Nissan Leaf and the Renault Zoe have been around for a decade. And when those two electric cars came on board, they cost a huge amount of money. They're very small cars, and you were lucky to get 80 or 90 miles range out of them. Now we've got everyone coming on board, all the brands producing cars that are kind of £25,000-30,000 on a monthly finance deal, don't look quite as scary as they did. And they've got a range of, you know, anywhere between 200, 300, heading towards 400 miles, which makes them way more accessible. Add to that, people getting more and more charging points fitted in their houses because more brands have come on board to make that possible. Add to that more choice. It used to be that you just had these strange little cars or really expensive SUVs. Again, you take a manufacturer like Volvo now that's got a whole range of electrified vehicles, whether it's plug-in hybrid or pure electric, and they've made them kind of look and feel cool because they've got this recharge branding going on around them, and people think, that sounds nice, that sounds good. What have you got? I've got everything from small city runaround to large family SUV. And so consumer choice, consumer accessibility, and crucially, price coming down, and it's starting to fit consumer lifestyles more. And then finally, as you say, COVID and lockdown, the pandemic, that did get everyone thinking, well, you know, I'm more in tune with nature. That worked for some people. For others, it was like, I don't actually want to be in public transport anymore because of health and safety issues. I'd rather have a car, but I want to have a car that fits in with my view of my responsibility towards the planet. All these factors have come together at a really crucial time as we race to meet the 2030 deadline for the stopping of sales of new internal combustion engine cars.
Absolutely. Poppy, I'd like to bring you in here because you actually use your sizable social media presence and also your partnerships with brands to inspire people to reconnect with some of these issues. How effective do you think social media is when it comes to engaging younger audiences with these really complex issues around climate change and motivating them to take real action when it comes to the environment?
I think that social media is a really powerful tool, but as with all things that are really powerful, has a flip side. So I think that it has an incredible ability to spread information, ideas to demographics of people who would typically potentially be disengaged with those conversations. Demographics of people who wouldn't necessarily be receiving maybe political information, for example, in a format that they can digest, that's accessible to them. And when we talk about young people, I think that applies to many young people. I know myself was really disengaged from politics for a long while because it just wasn't digestible. And I think that this allows for a huge amount of information to circulate and reach lots of different people on the other side of the world, and even allows for us to kind of have access to the real-time realities of climate change, because, of course, we can, watch stories, share videos, and so we're not only accessing this information through like news channels, we can literally see lived experiences of what climate breakdown is like causing, which I think is really, really powerful. But on the other hand, I do think that kind of like increase of information and huge amount of sharing can be really debilitating and create this new sort of concept of climate anxiety, where a lot of people, particularly young people, are almost kind of like overwhelmed by this influx of information, which is so often focused on bad news and kind of the crisis we're facing rather than necessarily on activation and how we solve the problem. So I think that social media so far has had an amazing effect of spreading the message of what the problem is. But I think what's going to be really interesting and what I really try to do is focus on the solution. What can we do to make a change? And what can we do in our personal lives to make change? Because, of course, when we look at the climate emergency, we need top-down change, but we also need that to collaborate with grassroots action. So I think that social media has the ability to connect people and create activation where it maybe hasn't done enough so far. I think so far it has predominantly been a tool for spreading information. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that may shift.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do at Marie Claire, actually, and we find really challenging when we speak to our audience, is that people, are feeling that sense of overwhelm when it comes to, even interacting with some of these issues. And it's all about empowering them to make them feel that they can make a difference, isn't it? Are there things that you do with your audience that, are there any kind of steps and small kind of actions that people can do to make them feel a bit less disempowered? How can we encourage them to sort of be mini activists in their own right?
Yeah, so I often talk about how important it is to use social media but then drop out. I myself take every weekend offline entirely, because I think it's really important when we're bombarded with so much information to have time for that to process, to be able to integrate that into our day-to-day lives and figure out how we can connect in real life, whether that's joining pressure groups or joining local community garden or food bank, whatever it might be in real life. Taking the kind of conversation into the real world, I think, is really important. And unless we kind of start somewhere small, whatever that might be, like I talk about, the simplicity of growing sprouts is an incredible way to access where our food comes from and the amount of resource and energy that goes into that. Those really small actions done mindfully build up, and eventually you come from a place where you're potentially making decisions in a more conscious way and potentially having a really positive effect on your community by joining various networks. So that, I think, the main thing that I really advocate for is taking the information that we learn online into the real world and joining community groups, because ultimately as individuals we don't have a massive effect, but when we're interconnected with other people in real life, we can support each other and we can, create tangible change as a group.
Yeah. Marissa touched on the importance of diversity as well. How do you think we can move conversations around climate activism itself out of a predominantly kind of privileged and, space, and make it sort of relevant to people of all backgrounds. Is that something that you're working hard to do, and how do you do it? Like, how can we do it?
I think it's a really big question for me personally. I know that by occupying a space and being visible in the space of climate activism and food justice, land justice, that in itself, I hope, kind of it creates a kind of invitation for more people to join. I know growing up, I didn't see anybody who looked like me in these kind of spaces, and taking up space and talking publicly about these things. And I hope that can inspire a generation of people from demographics that maybe felt that these spaces weren't welcoming and they didn't see anyone like them occupying those spaces. So that's one of the things. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that social economic background has such a strong link with ethnic demographics. And obviously, when people are living in a situation where we're just trying to get by, there's not a lot of capacity to start focusing on trying to solve a climate emergency, because you're trying to solve your own real life emergency. As somebody who grew up in a family that did benefit from things like food banks, I'm really familiar with the reality of that. But in tandem with that, I'm also familiar with the reality that people from those kinds of situations, so often Black and ethnic minorities, are forced into understanding how to live sustainably due to a lack of, resources. I know that in our family, we couldn't waste. We didn't have the option to overconsume. We didn't have the option not to reuse and recycle. So I think that it's also really important to acknowledge that these demographics of people maybe aren't sort of like shouting about the experience of being sustainable, but they are being sustainable. And I think that equally, this kind of ties into the peasant food web, which I talk about regularly, which actually provides 70% of the world's food. Whereas the industrial agriculture systems only produce 30% of the world's food, but use 70% of the water supply within agriculture, and 80% of the fossil fuel emissions come from that kind of agriculture. So I think it's really important to kind of sometimes reframe the groups that we are elevating as the ones with solutions, and sometimes acknowledging that demographics of people who are marginalized often have a lot of wisdom to share, because they have to learn how to live in that sustainable way.
The lack of female representation has long been a problem, hasn't it, at climate change conferences, particularly the most sort of senior public-facing roles. What do you think are the main obstacles to women being more involved, and how are you working to change this?
So, this is such a great question. I think first, to kind of frame the perspective that we approach this from, we take a really intersectional approach to our work and our feminism. And for me, that means using a feminist lens to look at power dynamics and how certain people have access to power and certain people are prevented from accessing power based on their social identity. So this kind of lies at the heart of our work. And, it's no surprise that women and historically marginalized communities are the most vulnerable to the consequences of the climate crisis. And it's a very gendered thing. We know women have less access to land, resources, decision-making, lower wages, and all of these things make it really difficult to navigate the fallout of climate change. So in terms of, trying to implement a more feminist approach and really center women's experiences and voices, there are a couple different routes to go about this. One of the key things that COP has committed to is kind of this gender mainstreaming, which basically means gender is considered at every point in decision making. So there's a lot of analysis about how people with different genders have different experiences. And, we encourage a particularly intersectional look at that. So to also take into account race, ability, ethnicity, et cetera, to make sure it's not a kind of monolithic understanding of how women are impacted by this. But I think gender mainstreaming is a really important tool, but it it is still limited in its perspective. So one of the things that we would really like to see out of policy is taking this much more comprehensive approach, and rather than kind of incorporating gender as one aspect of consideration in policymaking and in decision-making spaces, really rooting the purpose of policy, the purpose of climate change initiatives in meeting the needs of people who are the most vulnerable. So that means including them in decision-making and inviting them in to really just fortify this connection between governments and policymakers and civil society and grassroots activists, and making sure that there's this really clear channel that the people who are impacted by the consequences of policy have a direct line to the people who are enacting these policies. And women's representation in government is another hugely important part of this. As I think one of the examples that came out recently in the UK was that there was going to be an all-men delegation to COP, which is just, I mean, it's a joke in this day and age, honestly. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. So it's no surprise that we need more women involved in decision-making positions. And I think not just included, in delegations, in groups, but included in positions of leadership. This is hugely important. And it's not because women are, inherently better at climate change policy or better at peace building or anything like this. That's, very, I think, gendered perceptions of why it's a good idea to have women involved. But really, at the heart of it, we just need lots and lots of different experiences to actually make well-rounded, well thought out policy. A lot of the same kind of people have historically been in positions of power in the UK, to the degree where, the majority of prime ministers have all gone to the same school, let alone the same university. So if the same group of people are continually kind of filtering policy decisions through their experiences, we're missing out on the most of human experiences, like the majority of human experiences. So I think for this reason, kind of cracking open the policy space to be really accessible and open and welcoming to a diversity of different people is just absolutely critical to actually making good policy that's innovative, that is outside of the box. It isn't just politics as usual.
Mm. Can you talk us through how the climate crisis sort of intersects and has a knock-on effect on other social issues, and how you would, your organisation is helping to highlight some of those issues around COP?
Yeah. Oh gosh, it interacts with everything. There's such an overlap between the climate crisis and just every other issue. And in a lot of ways, it exacerbates existing inequalities, and existing inequalities exacerbate the climate crisis. It's all just deeply, deeply interconnected. And I think, kind of thinking from a UK perspective, one of the things that stands out so clearly to me is how the UK's history of colonization has had a dramatic impact on the climate crisis as it has developed. And, we talk a lot about sustainability, and a lot of the practices of colonization were explicitly unsustainable and exploitative, and just generally focused on how to use up materials and use up people and then move on. So a lot of the issues that we're facing today, and a lot of these kind of historical inequalities and the institutional racism that still exists in the UK and around the world, have a really direct line back to the actions of the UK and other colonizing states. So I think drawing attention to this history and subsequent responsibility to really take significant action is very much crucial, in my opinion, if the UK government is to take really meaningful action. And I think for us, a lot of that is helping government officials understand what it means to do feminist policy, what it means to kind of center women and marginalized people in the policy process and take their experiences on board. And we also kind of, as I mentioned before, want to create a space for policymakers and civil society to come together and talk about the issues very collaboratively and kind of jointly come to decisions about what works and what doesn't work and what can change and what needs to be different. It's a massive undertaking, and I think it's a little bit slow. It's going to be a slow process for sure. But I do know there are certain people in the UK government that I know I trust wholeheartedly are invested in making a difference and really just passionate about making a change and putting rights to these historical wrongs.
Yeah. And when it comes to purchase power and the power we all have as consumers, it's also very important to engage women in these issues, isn't it? Because women are often the ones making the decisions in the home. And Erin, I know that that's something that you've done a lot of work around. Just how influential women are within families, communities. If we want people to change the way that they're behaving, we have to involve women, don't we?
Oh, it's extraordinary. And the whole thing has been vastly underestimated by the automotive industry and to a certain extent continues to be. Women in the UK right now make up about 48% of license holders. OEM car brands used to think that that car brands knew that they were they were the main influencer in the purchasing decision of around 85% of car purchases. But I think what a lot of car brands have yet still to wake up to is the fact that actually women are moving from being the influencer behind the purchasing decision to being the purchaser. More women than ever need their independence to get around. They're multitasking, running businesses, working from home, juggling childcare, all that sort of stuff. More women than ever are the primary earners, are independent, are single, want vehicle. Just because cars are going electric doesn't mean they're not still going to be fun to drive, going to be status symbols, going to be highly desirable. Women are really going to vote with their feet. And who are they going to buy these wonderful, sexy, electric, sustainable products from? They're going to buy them from brands who talk their language. They're going to buy them from brands who show women in their marketing communications, behind the wheel, by the way, not in the passenger seat. They're going to be able to sell them to women who look at car brands and go, but I don't care about the 0 to 60. I care about what materials you've used inside. What's the connectivity like? Can I make calls while I drive to work? Can I order stuff for home? All this stuff. And the fact that the car is moving from being a product that traditionally has always been about engineering and powertrain and oversteer and V10s to a product that is entirely based around a singular powertrain, thus knocking that conversation out of the window. And so the only story to tell about cars is their level of sustainable interiors, their level of connectivity, that they are that third space after office and home. That's a conversation that's set up for women right there. And it's really exciting. And I want more car brands to grab hold of that.
Yeah, I think it's something that we've seen, right across the board when we speak to women at Marie Claire, that the brand values and the story is increasingly increasingly important to female consumers. Poppy, you work with various brands. Why do you feel it's so important to collaborate with brands that share your values? And what kind of reaction do you get from your followers and around some of the partnerships that you've made and the brands that you work with?
Yeah, well, I suppose firstly, collaborating with brands allows me to put out other free content for people, which really ties into the stuff we were talking about previously. But beyond that, it's also really kind of, I suppose, ties again into what we were talking about previously. It's a way to demonstrate how we can become conscious consumers and kind of showcasing or spotlighting brands that I believe in and support, and I see as part of the future, part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And for me personally, Volvo and all their commitments are just such a brilliant example of a company that previously was part of the problem and are entirely shifting gear to become part of the solution, and not just be part of the solution, but be really vocal about it. And I think the fact that they wanted to collaborate with someone like me, who is predominantly educating around food growing, land justice, connection to nature, all these things which are just so rooted in sustainability and understanding how we can develop a reciprocal relationship with the earth. I feel like that speaks volumes. So I'm really, really proud to be collaborating with them. And I feel like, spotlighting brands that are doing the right thing is a really important part of the work I do, because obviously we do need to get around. It's quite nice to consider some kind of like Eden future where we're all walking and cycling our bikes, but in reality, that's not going to happen, certainly not tomorrow. And so electric cars, Volvo's electric cars, for me, are a really brilliant solution.
Thank you so much. I'm going to finish up by asking you all about a small action that you've made in your own lives that makes you feel that you're making a bit more of a difference. It could be something that you've adopted over lockdown, or something that you're pledging to do for the next year. But I know that the topic of climate change, as we've spoken about, can be an overwhelming conversation. I'd love to just finish by talking about anything that makes you individually feel empowered and that you're making a difference. Let's kick off with you, Nicole.
Yeah, and just to say, because what I think it's very difficult to sort of work with a brand and for a brand like Volvo, and then go home and decouple everything that you do in your kind of day to day, and then just act as if that's not happening. So it has definitely been part of my DNA as it is the brands. And I think today we're launching zero omissions, not emissions, to really talk to what Poppy just mentioned, which is that actually across the board, let's not miss anything out. We are part of the problem as a car manufacturer. We do need to get people from A to B, and we're doing what we can to make sure that's as sustainable as possible. But it's not going to be alone. It's not going to be enough on its own. So what else can we do to contribute to the solution? And that's why I suppose when you go back home, it's very difficult if you really buy into that kind of purpose to then, continue. So for me, I have a relatively new baby. So there's been question marks around what to use. And I think I'm very conscious around wipes, very conscious around nappies, and really just thinking, about what that does to the environment. And we've looked across the board about how long it takes for something to decompose across different plastics. And when you really get those metrics and there's that data in your head, it definitely does stay. So I think looking at shopping as well, and trying not to buy everything in plastic, but looking at the decanters you can buy to buy the volume you need, rather than buying huge amounts in bulk in these massive plastic containers, has been something that, and I think, again, it's a habitual change. First of all, it's uncomfortable, and then you adjust, and then it becomes really uncomfortable to go back to what you were doing before. So I think it's these small changes, but then again, that ripples into my husband, ripples into our family, and then we all kind of feel that is the best way to go.
Thank you. How about you, Erin?
Well, I'm conscious. I'm a motoring journalist, and I have been doing my fair share to massively enlarge my carbon footprint over the past few years driving supercars. So I've got my electric charging point fitted and drive electric cars as much as my job permits. But on the personal side, I've, with much sadness, ditched my plans for a wood-burning stove. And I'm going through, my children will be delighted to hear that I go through the laundry pile and put back the stuff in there that they whack in clean, ready to be washed and doesn't need washing, and that we're only washing clothes, when we actually need to.
Fantastic. Marissa, how about you?
I feel like a lot has changed in my life over the past year and a half. The pandemic has prompted some, overhauls, I think. And one of those was moving out of London into the countryside. So I'm now out in Kent, and just have a lot more space and more garden. And so my husband and I have tried and often failed in some attempts to kind of start growing our own food. We're now composting, which is a journey, and sometimes ends up terribly and sometimes ends up okay. So we're just kind of trying to figure out what works for us. But even now downstairs, I've got my little indoor spinach that I'm trying to grow for my food. So we're really making an effort to jump into gardening and all of these things. And it's been delightful. And I think good for my mental health as well as good for the environment, to be honest. So that's been very joyful, actually.
And what a lovely side benefit that it's actually feeling good for you as well. Poppy, shall we finish with you?
Yeah, there's a few things that I do, and I suppose because my job is really advocating for sustainable change, it's a really big part of my life. But I think that the key things that I talk about are I don't fly anymore. I'm flight free. That's a huge way to reduce our carbon footprint, which has been pretty easy through COVID, but obviously things are opening up now, but I'm still going to commit to flight free. And I think I've been flight free for about 3 years now. And then eating a predominantly plant-based diet. And then the thing that I also advocate for and do myself is, as Marissa was saying, composting is an excellent way of, creating a really brilliant resource that you can either use yourself or give to a community garden, but also reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because when our organic waste goes onto landfill, it pollutes groundwater, but it also produces methane, which is a greenhouse gas emission. So it's a really great way of reducing that tangibly, while also learning about the kind of cycles within nature to reduce waste. Composting is one of them.
Thank you, Poppy. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you today for your fantastic contributions. And if you want to follow the conversation further, just head to maryclaire.co.uk. Thank you very much for joining us.